Hello and welcome back to the Editorial, TLDR's podcast where we run through the last 2 weeks worth of our content, discuss why we made the decisions we did, and react to your critiques and criticisms, which is always fun. As always, I'm joined by TLDR's Editor-in-Chief, Zach Michaelis.
Hello.
Hello, welcome back.
Nice to see you.
It's been more than 2 weeks actually.
It
I said
has.
2 weeks in the intro, but it's been about a month because we missed 1 week because I think you were away having a lovely time.
We basically missed one
and
episode.
then we missed another one because we recorded it last week and it turns out we hadn't really recorded it.
Yeah.
So it's been a little bit. Nice to be back. Got a few things to talk through. We've obviously got all of the stuff we've released, but we've also got to discuss the potential brutal murdering of the TLDR US channel and the reaction we've got to that. Let's save that for a moment though. Let's go through our normal stuff first. What's the reaction to content been over the last month or so?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of content to cover, but unfortunately this podcast has worked too well and we don't actually have that many complaints.
What a nightmare.
We basically had 2 videos that didn't do well, but received some sort of pushback.
Yeah.
One on EU, one on global.
Mm-hmm.
Then we start with the one on EU, which was the Italy video.
Yeah.
The Italy video, unfortunately for us at least, we did make a fair few mistakes, and as we did mention them in the pinned comment, but we're just, once again, apologies. That is our bad. No excuses.
Mm-hmm.
So we can only apologise for those.
What were the mistakes? Just for
I think the main mistake was that you called the Fratelli d'Italia the FDL instead of the FDI, and there's a sort of explanation or excuse there. Obviously, is that the in Arial font, which is the one we use, uppercase I looks identical to a lowercase L.
Especially because it's a lowercase d, so I kind of assumed it wasn't all caps. I assumed it was upper, lower, lower. Even still, FDI makes more sense considering Italy.
A lot more sense.
But what can you do?
I think there were a couple of other errors. There was an animation error where someone mixed up essentially the colours with appropriate logos of the various parties when they were doing a graph of the new Senate. And there was also some pushback on the idea that Maloney and the FDI should be described as far right.
Yeah.
I think, to be fair, we mentioned this in the pinned comment on that video. We don't actually really... I mean, obviously, actually, we do call them far right in the thumbnail and towards the end of the video. But we do make it clear in the video that their politics, their actual policies, are pretty standard for a European Conservative Party these days. Yeah. And they're actually very, very similar ideologically to the Conservatives in the UK. Yeah. That's probably like their best analogue. And I think that's probably... I think we did pretty well there, basically. I think that's more than a lot of English-speaking news outlets do. Yeah. We did go through their policies and explain their various policy positions and how they've changed over the years. Nonetheless, I think that the label far right is you can at least justify it. It might not. You can also justify probably just right, but you can probably just about make an argument for calling them far right. Yeah. Obviously, this is essentially a semantic point. It depends where you consider the natural middle of politics, and that's just a very, very loaded, very difficult question. But I'm sympathetic to the fundamental point, which is that it's quite lazy to just label them far right, but I'm not necessarily sure that that's a fair criticism given the amount of detail we went into their policies in that video. Okay. So, I think if you clicked on the thumbnail and saw us calling them far right, maybe you had grounds for irritation because you think, it's a bit lazy. Some of their politics are actually more moderate than the label suggests. But actually, we do mention that in the video. Yeah. So, sort of half apology for that one. We did make some errors, but only a half apology for calling them far right. Okay.
And there was another one, right? There's
another video.
Another contentious video.
Do we make another mistake in the Italy video?
I don't know. That's a pretty good list of mistakes.
We did make one more mistake in the Italy video. This is a half mistake, but again, I should apologise for this because it wasn't made sufficiently clear. In the video, we do seem to imply that this is the first time that they've used their new, very complicated electoral system. Yes. What is meant by that is that this is the first time they've used the new complicated system, which is known as the Rosatellum, in combination with their new reduced parliament size. So that's the first time they've used this particular this particular electoral system, the combination of the weird method and the particular size of the parliament, which has had some interesting consequences on the race, because obviously lots of MPs are losing their seats, and they've tried to sort of, I don't know, dig their way out of that. But yeah, we didn't make that clear. The Rosatellum rules came in 2017. There was an election in 2018. So we should have made it clear that Rosatellum system was actually used before. But yeah, apologies for that.
Okay. And the other contentious video?
The other contentious video was on a contentious topic. It was on TLDR Global, and it was on the sabotaging of the Nord Stream pipelines.
Of course.
Yeah, exactly. This is a really interesting topic, and we still haven't got an answer about who did it. I think the reason we haven't got an answer about who did it is because no one really wants to know, because if it was the Russians, NATO comes under a lot of pressure to escalate, essentially, to respond accordingly, because it's an attack on, it's not within Danish territorial waters, but it is a pipeline that's A, within their exclusive economic zone, and B, connected to a European NATO member. So I think that's the reason that no one really wants to say it's the Russians. Equally, if it was the Americans, no one wants to say it's the Americans, because you don't want to. If you find out it's the Americans,
what do you do then?
Yeah, what happens then? Who knows what happens then? For what it's worth, and we make this point in the video, we sort of conclude that we think it's more likely that it was the Russians. I still stand by that. The argument I say, I suppose I did make it. I read the script. The argument I make in the video is that while there are superficially reasons to suspect the Americans, and while it's not immediately obvious what the Russians stand to gain from sabotaging both pipelines, it's when you just spend a bit more time thinking about it, you realize that it fails a basic cost-benefit analysis from the American perspective. Whatever gains the Americans might stand to achieve by sabotaging Nord Stream, the thing that people speculate is that obviously the Americans didn't like Nord Stream in the first place. So because it created this economic interdependence between Germany and Russia, which undermined NATO unity. It's just massively outweighed by even the trivial risk of them being found out, because obviously if the Americans get found out, that's basically the end of NATO. That really is, that would put a massive strain on the relationship, not just between Germany and the US, but the entirety of Europe and the US. And it would undermine trust in America for decades. It would just be a massive event. So I don't think it's going to be the Americans. I also think it's worth noting that while the Americans don't like Nord Stream, and they made that very, very clear, they already got Scholz to turn it off, and damaging it doesn't rule it out for the future. Absolutely, because obviously it's just going to get fixed. So at worst, if it was the Americans, the thinking presumed has to be then that they were just sort of warning the Germans, like, oh, you try and get this going again, we'll do this again.
Do it again.
Which just, it's just not very much of a benefit to the Americans, is it?
No, with the cost being so high.
Yeah, exactly. And Biden already scared Scholz into doing it. There was what happened I remember there's an amazing press conference, I think it's like 22nd of February, and it's before obviously the Russians invade, which happens a couple of days later. And Scholz, until that point, had been sort of ambiguous about whether or not the Germans would continue to take gas via Nord Stream. And there's a press conference with him and Biden speaks first. And a reporter asks Biden, what are you going to do? What's going to happen to Nord Stream if the Russians invade? And Biden just says, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. And then Scholz has to get up. Has to be like, yeah, fair enough, okay, it's not going to happen. But it doesn't look like they've pre-agreed it. It looks like Biden, either by gaffe or sort of the very coercive diplomacy, just goes like, nah, we're not having this. We're America, we choose. And so I think given that Biden has already demonstrated he has the political strength to get the Germans off it, also given that it looks very unlikely that gas is going to start flowing through Nord Stream ever again, I still think that, some people are more cynical than I am and think that actually when this all calms down, the Germans are going to get right back on the Russian gravy train. I think that's an overly pessimistic, overly cynical interpretation of events. The US doesn't stand to gain much. I think what is more likely is it Putin and the Russians playing their only card, which is sort of more energy, essentially restating the threat to cut off European energy supplies. But Putin's sort of main leverage throughout the whole conflict has been his ability to limit European energy supplies. But he's now exhausted all his obvious leverage. You know, there's very little gas is flowing into Europe. Most of it's flowing via the Turk Stream into Turkey, which, you know, doesn't really get to most of the big consumers.
Yeah.
And obviously, a lot of European countries have self-imposed embargoes on Russian gas imports.
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't really have the leverage he did at the beginning of the war. And the Europeans have made actually really quite impressively good progress on weaning themselves off Russian gas. I mean, if you told most commentators a couple of months ago that European storage levels would be above 80%, which is what they are now.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the Europeans have essentially filled up their storage. I think the exception is Hungary, but even the Hungarians have got to like sort of 75, 80%.
Sure.
They're very near the mandated levels required by the Commission.
Yeah.
They would have been like, no, there's no way the Europeans are going to be able to do that. But we have, and we've done it mostly by importing lots of liquefied natural gas and putting pressure on prices in Asia. But I think what's happened here is Putin's lost his leverage, and he's gone, okay, if I can't basically coerce the Europeans into cutting off supply to support for Ukraine with my own gas, what I'm going to do is start threatening their gas supplies, the gas supplies between European states.
Yeah.
And I think it's no coincidence that the sabotage that affected Nord Stream pipelines happened the same day as the Norwegians and the Poles, or was it the Poles? I think it's the Poles, were opening a new pipeline called the Baltic Pipe. Which is going to essentially run Norwegian gas all the way down to Central Europe through the Baltic Sea. So I think that's probably the most plausible interpretation of events. Putin has gone, okay, well, here's the warning shot, guys. You know, if you continue supporting Ukraine, the one thing I still can do, even if you don't need my gas, is I can cut off essentially Norway's gas, because most of these interconnected cables run down from Norway through to the rest of Europe. You know, Norway now, post-Ukraine, post-Russia, supplies something like 30% of Europe's gas, and obviously if you cut off 30% of your one continent's gas supply, you really fuck prices. So
controversy there.
I can understand the controversy. I think, to be fair, that I've just restated my argument. I still think it's a sound argument. I think it's a good argument, but some people are just more, they just think the Americans are more, I don't know, Machiavellian than I do.
Yeah.
And like whether or not you think it's the Russians or the Americans will depend on how Machiavellian you think the Americans are.
Sure.
And if you're sort of thinking of like, deep state America sort of, doing coups all over the country and weird black ops, then maybe you believe in that sort of thing. And ultimately, I don't know how Machiavellian the Americans are. You know? No one really does. That's the scary thing about them. But so I think you can plausibly explain the discrepancy in opinion by pointing to the fact that I underweight how Machiavellian the Americans are.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but you get my idea.
I get your point.
Yeah, cool.
Besides that, though, pretty strong results across the other channels. I think we've had some really good numbers on UK in reaction to all of the economic chaos has been here.
Oh, yeah.
Europe, we've obviously had a lot of stuff in relation to Ukraine, all the map update kind of videos.
Yeah.
They've been doing really well. Global, we've had a few good hits, kind of more recent ones. They've been fairly successful, so that's good to see. Which brings us to the US channel, where we have been having some long-term difficulties. I think if you've not seen the video where we talk about this, I would recommend checking out the kind of the threat. But essentially, the US channel for a while now hasn't been performing as well as basically any other channel. And that means that we've been releasing less content, which probably perpetuates the issue and creates some kind of vicious cycle. But essentially, it's hard for us to justify making US content at the moment because the US content reliably does worse. And if we've got a certain amount of videos we can release a week and we're not going to see the returns both economically and just trying to give our audience what they want, it kind of makes no sense, releasing US content. However, we like making US content. We think there's a need and a purpose to. So we've kind of said we're going to give US content another go. We're not fully giving up. As we head into midterms, we're going to see how it goes then, and then at the end of the year, we'll kind of review once again. So that's kind of our thoughts at the moment. Do you want to add anything to that, or do you just broadly think same as me?
Yeah, I do think same as you. I think the thing we should say here, though, is obviously full credit and no blame to our brilliant US team, because they do write phenomenal stuff. And probably some of the best writers we have around of all the channels.
Sure.
it's partly just, well, we don't really know why it is. I think it's probably mainly that the US news market, especially on YouTube, is more saturated than say the European one. But yeah, it's a tough one.
So we asked for people's response and kind of thoughts on this, and I've kind of summarized some of the core ones just because I think most of them we kind of have a response to already, but some are kind of thought-provoking. The first was a lot of people saying we should get Americans to make the videos, which we do.
Americans.
Certainly from a writing side, I'd say the majority,
vast
majority of our videos are written by Americans.
Yeah.
From a voiceover presentation perspective, I see the argument to some extent that having an American voice, it could be useful because it's an American talking to Americans. I do think, well, one, if we had to do that, that's almost a disqualifying factor in itself, because if we had to have like studio space in America to record videos, or we'd have to have someone on board who's able to record videos at home or whatever, that's a roadblock that will delay us reliably by 24 hours every time we need it, because you wouldn't be able to have someone who, a drop of a hat, could record in an American accent.
Yeah,
so you're inevitably forcing a delay there, and at that point, it's not worth it. Also, I do think we don't do it for any other channel. There's no other channel or any other country where we would do that for. And I get the argument the US is a huge market, and especially English-speaking market. But I do think we can't kind of...
And the stereotype is that Americans have a little bit of an affinity for British voices. So, you know...
Data does suggest they trust British voices more generally.
Exactly.
And I do think it does help because it projects our kind of USP, which is the independence, the unbiasedness, apoliticalness. And I think if we're coming with an outside voice, sure, there'll be people that say, you don't know what you're talking about, you're from Britain. Yeah. But equally, it's very clear that we don't have a stake in the game in the same way that an American would, which is maybe a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, obviously, we have the American writers, but we have a bit more of an outsider's perspective, which actually, looking through the comments, is one thing a lot of people commented on, is they really appreciate kind of the more European lens that we look at it through. Yeah. And I think having a British voice on that actually helps rather than hinders. And even if it doesn't help, there's not much we can do because it would just be too much aggravation. We'd have to shut it down anyway if we had to get an American. People also suggested we kind of modified the channel and turned it into a TLDR Americas, and obviously include the rest of North America and South America, which I don't think is a bad idea in and of itself. I just think America the US would still dominate that channel, and I think actually South American content would do worse than US content would on average. So I think if anything, you're dragging down the channel further. You're opening up the remit of what you can cover, but you are also stealing content from global, basically. Yeah. You're shutting down 2 continents for global. Europe is also already off global's table, basically. So then global basically becomes Australia, Asia, Africa. Yeah. Like, that is basically it. And I mean, we don't do that much South American content, so it wouldn't be deadly. But I don't think that would necessarily work, unfortunately.
You hate to admit it, but the US is sort of its own little continent. When it comes to news, at least.
I can see maybe including Canada with them.
Yeah.
But I do think the Canadian content on average will do worse than Americans, then you're not solving any issue.
You just drown out all non-US content.
Exactly. Some people suggested the topics we're choosing, we should pick stuff that's less kind of in the headlines and go for stuff that's slightly more abstracted, which I think could be useful because we do have the time zone issue of we're communicating with people who are constantly on a delay during our work day, and then communicating back and forth when they're suggesting ideas or whatever. There's the constant barrier there. So I think if we're trying to chase headlines less, that is helpful, and I think we do that sometimes. Someone specifically suggested we should do more videos a bit like the Why Greece's Economy is Still Failing video, which is relevant and timely, yet not what the media are already talking about, which I think is a fair point, and I think we should maybe try it over the next month.
Yeah, I agree. It's an interesting recommendation because obviously I think that what's happened across all TLDR channels is we have slightly moved away from the evergreen content. We definitely chase headlines more than we used to.
Yes.
But I think that's actually mainly because we now have the competence and the capacity for it.
Yes, definitely.
Before we just couldn't keep up with the news, and now we sort of can.
Yeah.
But it's actually quite a good suggestion. I quite like that.
I don't mind it either, to be fair. I think we should. Penultimate one really is that we should have a specific, kind of related to the first point, that we should have a specific dedicated US team working on it. So like have a US writer and animator maybe, which wouldn't be impossible. We could do that. And I think if you had one writer, one animator in the US, you broadly keep both of them busy. The writer might have a bit too much free time, but you could. The problem is just the money.
Yeah,
you would be chucking tens, if not approaching 100,000
Yeah.
on a couple of people per year, and not 100,000. That would be expensive.
Yeah, it's
dollars,
an office.
American.
You'd probably
Yeah,
need
you'd
an
also have to get the office
in Washington as well. So
that would be fun though.
Yeah,
but no, it's just the cost there. You'd be investing a lot of money. Even if you only said we're doing this for a year, temporary contract for both of the employees. One, employing people remotely and kind of the legal and logistical issues there are pretty high barrier. And two, you're pouring, say, 100 grand into it, which
terrifying.
We could do.
We
but
couldn't really do.
We could.
Yeah, we could.
We'd be stupid to, but we have 100 grand which we could pour into it. But why would we do that?
We don't have that much more than 100 grand.
That is true.
Yeah, I think it's always quite funny when you see like the comments being like, "Come on, guys, a channel of your size, you should have like X, Y, or Z." And
yeah.
Like, what do you mean of our size?
Yeah, it's true.
Like we've got 7 people.
Yeah. So we could. If it was, I don't know, if we had the same issue, but it was the scale of the EU channel at the moment, you could maybe say, well, okay, if we can increase our thing and we're already at approaching 1 million on a bunch of videos. I also
just don't think you get much of a return on that investment. Like, really,
I think it would improve things, but not enough to justify the effort.
I think there are more fundamental issues at play. More structural issues that we should focus on before we start moving.
And I think if we're employing 2 more people, they shouldn't be working on US content, realistically.
No.
Like,
we'll see how well the next couple of months
we'll see. And then finally, a bunch of people commenting on like the fact they see a need for our kind of independent, non-biased coverage in the US. They're gonna, like, if we do kill the channel, they're gonna miss it, which I am sympathetic to.
Yeah,
but
it's very flattering, but we really shouldn't be your only source of news.
Especially when we released 28 videos on US this year.
Yeah.
Like, if that's your primary source of news, I think you need a little bit more news.
Yeah.
No, and I do get the point, and I think I can see, even beyond the quantity of videos, I can see that people look at the EU or UK output and think, oh, I wish that the US channel had 3 to 4 videos a week, and we had like the full fleshed out TLDR US experience. Yeah. I think the only thing I would say there is, well, one, I mean, find other media outlets, because like we're never going to be that. And two, I mean, we did say in that video that even worst case scenario, and we do kill US, we would migrate content to global anyway. So we would still be covering US topics. So if you really are going to miss US if it were to go, and we would warn you before it did go, obviously, then maybe it's worth subscribing to global at this point just to be potentially ready, because we're not going to stop covering US. It's just having it in its own silo and having it trying to grow its own unique audience rather than growing with another channel. If we can't kind of jumpstart momentum in the next couple of months, it probably doesn't make it much sense having it on its own any longer.
Yeah, I think it's a good plug for global.
Good plug for global.
Yeah,
Very
absolutely.
nice plug for global. I think that's everything then. I think I'm interested in any more responses on the US thing. In the comments of this video, we'll respond next time probably. And probably by next time we'll have a better indication of how US is going, and we'll kind of keep you updated as the year plays out. But yeah, a couple of controversies, pretty good.
Pretty low
considering it was a month
these days. Yeah, we're
pretty okay.
I think the podcast really has worked too well, because we now do actually check our mistakes and stuff, because I don't want to get on here and apologise to everyone.
Okay, well, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time, hopefully, and we can review the mistakes we do make and respond to your kind of feedback on US.
Nice one.
We'll see you then.
Lovely. I'll cut that bit, definitely.
You like the thumb?
I went for
Crossbody thumb.